We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast was produced, the Gadigal People of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present.
It's the 9th of November 2019 and David Knoff has been at sea for 2 weeks. He's on an icebreaker ship that's tediously making its final slow approach to Antarctica. He's here to take over the role of station leader at the Davis Research Station. He's thousands of kilometres from home, in one of the world's harshest environments. Whilst there, he'll experience hurricane-force winds, freezing temperatures, and total darkness for 6 months of the year. But he's grinning from ear to ear. He's finally made it. But what was meant to be a routine mission lasting just 1 year was thrown into uncertainty when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, leaving David and his team stranded in one of the most isolated places in the world. I'm at Middleton and this is Head Game. Today, a story of remote leadership, endurance and humanity during a time of absolute uncertainty. David Knoff, welcome to my podcast, Head Game, mate. Now, before we start, I just got to ask, how old are you?
That's an interesting first question. 39.
Yeah. 39?
Yeah.
Wow, well, 39, mate, you've had quite the career, and I'm just going to reel off a few things. You graduated from Monash University with a Bachelor's of Arts whilst completing officer training in the Australian Army. You served in the Solomon Islands as an infantry platoon commander in 2007. Following this, you joined the Australian's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Is that DFAT?
Correct. Yep.
Serving at the Australian High Commission in Islamabad, Pakistan. And then you decided to join the Australian Antarctic program as station leader at the Davis Research Station. Mate, for the age of 39, you have, God, talk about a resume. I thought I'd done a lot. So let's unravel this. Let's unpick it because it's fascinating, mate. And it's first and foremost good to speak to one of my own. Let's start from the beginning, I suppose. What made you want to join the military? And do you come from a military background, a military family?
Not from a military family, other than sort of some Second World War grandfathers like everyone had. There was no real drive other than at the end of my first year of university. I'm like, this isn't enough. This is just not exciting enough. And I joined the Australian Army Reserve, or the Territorials, or National Guard, or whatever it is in the different nations. And straight away, like a kind of horse to water, I'm like, this is what I want. This is more exciting. It's out. It's adventurous. It's leadership. It's all these other things. And thankfully, I joined when I was nice and young. So I was only 19 then. A year or so through officer training. And the strange thing about that platoon I led over in the Solomon Islands back in 2007, I was the second youngest guy in the platoon as the platoon commander, which outside of the military sounds ridiculous. And people go, how on earth could you be the officer and be in charge of 30 soldiers, some of whom were nearly 50 years old?
That's why I ask, mate. That's why I ask your age, because I think it's extremely important to realise, how rare that is to have such a young platoon officer commander as yourself. Even for me, and I know the military inside out like yourself, that's extremely young. Did people take you seriously, or did they? How did that play out for you?
Yeah, I think I had a good platoon sergeant, like straight away, and good NCOs. As you'd know, that's the one thing that makes a young junior officer work well, is that they listen with their ears and don't come in with an idea of, hey, I'm in charge of doing it my way, which is absolutely a recipe for disaster and has happened throughout history. So I listened to my NCOs, trusted them, and they were incredibly experienced, and they set me up for success. And there was a lot of things, like even just the delineation of the roles between what the officers and the NCOs do. When you stay in your lane, there's stuff that the NCOs don't want to go to all the boring meetings at company and task force headquarters and come up with all the ops plans and do all the reconnaissance stuff to kind of go, hey, we're going to go to these 3 villages in the coming month and we're going to do it this way. Like, they don't really want to do that. Look, I think as well, I probably wouldn't have been able to go to a war zone as a platoon commander at that age. But given that it was a peacekeeping operation, the bar was probably a bit lower. And so it worked well to go, okay. And then the few real live operations we had to do, you just had this great thing. I go and do the planning stuff with the task force or the INT guys and work out how we're going to crack that nut of, okay, we've got to go to this village, we're trying to look for these people and do these things. We'll have to patrol through the jungle, get inserted by helicopters or trucks or whatever we're going to do. While the sergeant, the NCOs, they're off just getting a platoon level ready. You've given them the warning order, you've given them the kind of parameters of, okay, we're going to go and do this. So you walk out of that briefing room, the platoon's ready to go, you give them the orders, a little bit more battle prep to finalise it, then you jump in the vehicles and you drive out the FOB. And that, when that's humming, and I look back and go, geez, that was, and that's why I never stayed in the army. I'm like, I don't think it's going to get much better than this. To get operational command of a platoon at that younger age, you kind of go, oh, after that, you come back and you end up in training command and as a staff position, as a company 2IC and all these other things. You go, well, I don't know how exciting that's going to be. Whereas joining Foreign Affairs and Trade, they were like, oh, mate, we don't have kind of non-operational jobs. You're out and you can go any embassy anywhere in the world. And everyone always thinks, they go, why didn't you go to Paris or Tokyo or somewhere lovely? And I'm like, no, I didn't want to do that.
So how did that transition happen? Because I know it all too well. I was the same, I've done 3 tours of Afghanistan in my later years of my military career. I'm a bit like you in that way. I sort of get bored of things, and I think, what's the next thing that I need to do? What's the next hype? What's the next big adventure? Or what's the next adrenaline sort of fueled task ahead of me? What made you transition, and was it quite a seamless transition?
It was fairly seamless. So yeah, when I was in the Solomon Islands, we worked closely with the embassy there and DFAT. And it was the regional assistance mission Solomon Islands was led by DFAT and had federal police and had Australian Aid and all these different organisations, and the uniform military was just one part of it. We, of course, were the actionable arm. We'd do anything that the police couldn't handle, we'd step in and do that, always in tandem with the cops as well. But we do a lot of operations with the embassy. And I kind of thought, well, and at the time I was still finishing off my degree, which was in history and politics. So that was enough that was going to get me in the front door, or at least to an interview with them. And then having worked alongside them and seen what the embassy did or what embassy staff would do overseas, I'm like, you're actually affecting change. You're having a closer impact on it rather than just chasing down bad guys. And it was as fun as that is as a 22-year-old. Like that is, that's right up there, flying helicopters and stuff. It wasn't quite fun. And then it was a calculated, not risk, but calculated decision around staying in the army would have meant the chance. And at the time, you got to remember back in 2007 was the most operational the Australian Army had been almost in half a century. We had troops in the Solomon Islands, East Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, and then the peacekeeping like observers and stuff we've got in all these other places, and company in Butterworth and all these things that the Army does. So there was a lot going on, but it was still not guaranteed. And it was this risk of, all right, if I go to a full-time unit, you might be lucky enough that you're on the next online battalion, you get another trip, or you might end up just over in Afghanistan, but in a role that isn't that inspiring. You want command. Whereas with DFAT, there was certainly a much stronger chance or probability that you're going to get to go overseas, you're going to get to do the actual work. And I saw that as a and there's some safety elements to it as well. Yes, going to war's got an excitement to it that only soldiers kind of understand of, like, well, I wanted to go to war, which sounds ridiculous. And yet at a point, you probably would have found this with yours, like once you get to your second or third trips, you start to go, the clock's ticking at some point, well, what next? Yeah,
you do get to a level of what next. And what's the difference between the military and the Department of Foreign Affairs and how you adapted to that?
Straight away, you're going from working at the tactical level or operational level of platoon and company, or even just task force operations, switching to DFAT and work with the embassies, you're straight to the strategic level. So you're working, even as a fairly junior diplomat, you're working very, very, very sensitive things. You're working right at the pointy end. You'll be briefing foreign ministers or prime ministers when they're visiting the country. And certainly the postings I did to kind of Pakistan and Iraq, it was like chartering new ground. It wasn't kind of a strong relationship that had been going for years. It was very dynamic, very reactive to what the enemy did or what other nations did. And certainly in Pakistan and Iraq, we worked very closely with the British and the Americans, the French and Italians, and all the other NATO countries involved in those two conflicts. And yet you don't know what you're doing next week. You'll have an idea and a plan. And that's what I found fascinating. And the great thing was you had this freedom of, at a fairly junior level. And the role I had in Iraq, I was embedded with the Australian task group. So we were north of Baghdad, training and advise assist stuff with the Iraqis. I was kind of the lead of that cell. So you're not the ambassador per se, but you've got this sort of delegated authority of, hey, you're the Australian senior diplomat on the ground up there working with the Australian Task Group, you've got this freedom. And again, I was, probably 30-ish, and you've got that authority, and you're briefing foreign ministers, you're briefing defence ministers, you're briefing prime ministers, all this sort of stuff on what you're doing and advising what you should do, which to me was a great jump to kind of go from platoon level and reading about international relations in history books. And I was never the youngest. I was always on the younger side, and people were like, oh, geez, you're young for this role. But then you'd found an example of like, well, no, there was someone younger. Or just going back to history, it's people like, geez, you're a young platoon commander. I'm like, yeah, but historically, platoon commanders have been young. And same with junior diplomats. Yeah, a first secretary political in an embassy in Paris or Tokyo, they'll be older. But in the war zones, finding people young enough and keen enough and adventurous enough, and there was fitness elements to it, not necessarily like you're not stomping around packs and weapons and all the other stuff, but you're jumping on and off helicopters, you're in vehicles, you're wearing body armor, you're wearing practical clothing and stuff in 50-degree heat. So there's a fitness element to it that attracted and made it more suitable to the younger generations. And I had a ball. And even with the Antarctic program, I was quite young moving into that as a station leader, but I wasn't the youngest. And I never had a problem with it. Occasionally you'd meet people who had a chip on their shoulder over it of the, hey, we're the same age, and you kind of look at where they're at or they look at where you're at, and you can see them looking in their own mirror going, why do you get to be in charge? You're like, well, because, I am.
So you went from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs to joining the Australian Antarctic program as station leader. Now, talk to me about the Antarctic, because before you joined this program, it wasn't the first time you went to the Antarctic, was it?
No, so the first time I went down was with a bunch of mates who we'd all spent a number of years in war zones, so we're pretty cashed up. So I got an email from my mate who said, hey, I'm thinking of putting together this Antarctic trip. It's going to cost about this, which was a number of X's, and this is the loose plan. We'll work it out depending on who says yes. And I'm just like, yes, not knowing anything else other than like, I want to go to Antarctica and let's do it. And then we kind of put together, we're like, all right, what are we going to do? We worked out who was on the trip, what skills they had, and we ended up doing ski mountaineering. So I was riding a split board, so you can kind of turn into cross-country skis to do your ascent, and then lock it together, become a snowboard to do your descent. And we had an aim of doing a first ascent of a kind of, there's so many mountains down there. You can get first ascents of any rock. You just stand on a rock. You're like, I'm the first human to stand here. And we had that plan. We got weathered out. We never actually got a first ascent. Every time we'd get close, it'd just be white out. And you're going to speak to Mallory and Irving about ascending into clouds. But in those scenarios, you do it. But these days, that's not a great idea. So yeah, that was sort of the first trip I did. And then when the option came up to join the formal Australian Antarctic program and go as a station leader, it was an easy decision to be like, well, I loved Antarctic.
How did that spark the interest of you joining that program?
It was the wildlife and the wilderness of it. So I'd not gone down there with the intent of changing careers and moving to the Antarctic program, but when I got down there, saw it, and it is just the most spectacular place on earth. I mean, if you imagine you've seen the Karakoram Range and K2 and those, imagine that they're at sea level though, and you're driving around in a Zodiac with still water and orcas and leopard seals and whales and penguins and everything, but then also you've got 1,000-meter mountains just rising straight out of the ocean. There is nothing on earth that comes close. And that was what got me across the line to say, hey, I want to get back down here. And at the time, I was looking for something else. I'd had a decade with DFAT and in war zones again and thought, okay, let's do something different here. But at the same time, the Antarctic program, it's very similar to the operational elements of running a forward operating base or a military base overseas, except it's colourful. So you're not using camouflage and grey and green. Everything's brightly coloured buildings. You're down there for science, but it's got a whole lot of other risks and challenges where the bad guys aren't trying to kill you, but the weather will. And if you get your equipment wrong, or you get your planning wrong, you get your weather forecasts and understanding wrong, you can really create a lot of problems down there. It can change quickly. So that was something that appealed to me on the work side of it, not just the adventure and wilderness.
There's a common denominator here, Dave, is the leadership role. If it wasn't a leadership role, would you have taken it?
So the only job I was qualified for was station leader. So that was the option. Because as one of my team pointed out, he's like, the only thing required for your job is a driver's license. I'm like, yep, that's right. Now, I've got diplomas in ops management and all this other stuff as well. It doesn't matter. Like technically, all you need to be an Antarctic station leader is a driver's license, manual driver's license. You got to drive stick. But Whereas all the other roles on the station, you've got your scientists, so you need to be a PhD level glaciologist or seabird ecologist or benthic ecologist or some sort of scientific field that you've never even heard of. You've got to be that. Or you've got to be mechanics, plumbers, doctors, radio operators, comms technicians, satellite technicians, chefs. Everyone has a specific trade and skill set, whereas as a former infantry officer, you're not that qualified in a lot of transferable skills.
No cuff too tough, mate. No cuff too tough.
That's right. Other than being in charge of things and telling people what to do, which is what infantry officers are great at.
Yeah.
At the time, I would have taken a different role. I think now, having done 6 different trips, all in leadership roles in Antarctica, I'd struggle, and I do struggle when I'm not in charge. Like I've had a few. The role I was running a field camp. We were like 400 k's away from the main station, running the field camp of 42 people out in the middle of nowhere. Their own helicopters and own planes and all this sort of. We're in charge. We're doing it our way.
Yeah.
But to get there, we had to go through the main station at Casey, and the times I had to go through there, and I'm the kind of field leader trying to get my flights out and get my team out to our field camp, and there was. One of the station leaders was senior, but had been around a bit, so I didn't have to tell him much. But the other guy was quite junior, and the amount of times I've been there, I'm like, oh, hey, it's just a quick one. Like, when I was stationed, I actually think you should do it. And like, he was sick of me with about 10 seconds of telling him how to do things. So, and my team are like, I think you should eat it. And I'm like, yeah, no, I got it. I'll just shut up and just. Because
it's definitely, I would say that there's definitely that leadership mentality, and once it's ingrained in there. And, it's a different mentality, isn't it? It's just a different way of thinking, different way of processing things, and a different way of dealing with people. And it's a great position to be in.
I always like to say, though, like in terms of leadership mindset, yeah, you can come across as a control freak, and there's elements of that. But at the same time, the best leaders out there, they're really good followers, and they're really good. Fundamentally, the first thing you need to be is a good member of the team and a good follower. So when you're not in charge, you go, right, what's the job here? And whatever needs to be done, you just pick up the shovel or whatever it is, and you're doing it and helping and supporting the other leader. And I say this a lot of times, and you learn a lot more from your bad leaders than your good ones. Your good ones, you barely remember some elements. You're just like, oh, geez, Ant was great. You go, why was he great? You're like, I don't know. He was good. Whereas the bad ones, you'd be like, oh, this. So I always encourage people to look at that. But when there's poor leadership ahead of you, and it's so easy for a team to sit around and be like, oh, geez, he's doing this, or this is, I wouldn't do that. And you go, have you actually communicated that to them formally or properly, in a constructive way? And then if they have had a chance to listen to it and they've ignored you, then your decision process changes a little bit. But if you're not actually, and then what have you done to help them succeed? And I always use the example of the letter that Obama wrote to Trump in terms of like, your success will be our success as a nation. So I wish you all the best. Now, I'm sure he had to do that through gritted teeth, but it's this thing of, it's easy to look at another leader and go, oh, they're doing this wrong and blah, blah, blah. But you go, but what have you done as a team, or what have you done as the apparatus around that to give them success and help them do a good job of leading you? And what are you doing to be a good follower? Now, at the same time, if they start ignoring you and not listening to you and not listening to the team and not taking your advice or doing it their way every time, there's some other elements at play. And that's when you start to maybe go around a little bit and communicate to your informal leaders and your informal structures. And that becomes a really important part of your own leadership process, is understanding the informal processes around you by the time feedback gets to you, what's it gone through, and how much courage is it taken for someone to actually stand up and give you that, and how you take it on board or incorporate it into your plan can really make or break your team.
What was in your mindset when you decided to take on this station leader role? What was the vision of this task ahead of you, and how did you prepare for it?
Yeah, so it was a 1-year contract for myself and a team of 24. We'd go down to Davis on a 1-year contract. The first summer was going to have 100 people on station, all the scientists and all the kind of helicopters and all the frantic work that gets done. But we'd stay on for the winter after that and run the station for a year. So it had a very definitive set of goalposts. We were the 73rd continual rotation of Australian Antarctic presence. So, we're certainly going into a very, very structured and established system of, okay, the ships do this, the planes do that. Stuff goes wrong down there in terms of logistics chains and different events, but we could have never expected what would play out in our particular year. So we went in with a pretty clear mindset of, yes, this will be challenging, this will be hard, but challenges and obstacles and issues that were fairly predictable or fairly known challenges. And we do a lot of training. We all got together in Hobart before we left, and you do mental health and resilience training. Everyone's gone through a pretty rigorous selection process with psychs and assessments and physical tests and everything as well to make sure you're fit and healthy and you've got the right mental mindset as well to go down there. But that's only going to get, and that was all based around, it's a fairly set period of time. And the analogy I use as well with a lot of the military stuff of how different it must have been when they went and landed at Normandy. They didn't know how long it was going to take to win this, and they didn't even know they were going to win.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're in Afghanistan for yourself and the tours and stuff I did, you're on this 6-month or 3-month cycle, or 4 months on, and then you get a 2-week trip to Rome, and it had a good structure to it. Now you still don't know if you're coming home alive at the end of it, but you have this goalpost. And what happened to us in 2020 was we went from that structured system in the world that we all live in now of, okay, you're going to do this, you'll have these challenges and prepare yourself for this, and that's what's ahead of you. And it might deviate plus or minus 10, 20%. But what happened to us was we got to nearly 2/3 of the way through our trip when, and the writing had been on the wall for a while, but then formally they just came out and ripped the Band-Aid off and told us, like, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, we don't have any ships, we won't have any planes that can get to you this summer. We can't use an international team as well, or an international ship or anyone where everyone's doing their own thing. So the best thing for us is to leave you and your team there for an extra 6 months, potentially even longer, while we work out how to get you home and over to you. And it was this just bombshell. That's the chapter of the book. I called it the bombshell of just straight away from that moment on, we were in uncharted territory of we don't know when we're going home. We don't know how we're getting home. This is 2020 as well, so we didn't even know what home was going to look like when we did get there. And you're just trying to piece all that together. And it became this thing of, well, this might not be our fault. Like, we didn't have a hand in that decision at all, but it's our problem.
Just give us a picture of how your day-to-day life looked. What are you doing, on this program?
Yeah, so day-to-day life on an Antarctic station gets pretty routine, and every day, but at the same time, every day is different. Outside, it might be -10, -30 degrees, -40 even in the winter. If you don't wear the right equipment, you're going to get frostbite or freeze to death within moments outside. So you've always got to factor that in. Like, right, I've got to get my ass out of bed, stretch, get the blood moving for the day, and that's when you're on a station. When you're in a field camp, living in a tent, you're waking up and you're in your nice polar rated sleeping bag. But the minute you start unzipping that, it's -15 ambient in your tent. You've got your water bottles frozen, your pee bottles frozen, your socks are frozen because they were sweaty yesterday, and you're just going like, okay, I've got to try and find some non-frozen socks to get it. So I used to, these are better than the station example is you shuffle your ass to the kitchen and you have a bowl of cereal and look out the window. But living in an Antarctic field camp, I'd roll over and plank for like a minute and start doing push-ups just to get warm enough to get out of my sleeping bag to then put on your overalls and put on all your Antarctic layers to even then get out of your tent, which, some days there'd then be a foot of snow.
This is what I mean. Just to live, right? Just to function, you've got to be disciplined, right? And you've got to be motivated, You've got to love what you do because, and you'll be the best one to tell this, because if you're not, you're not getting out of that sleeping bag, right?
But you've got to be disciplined in different ways as well. So not just disciplined of, okay, the alarm's gone off or the generators have started, which means the camp's got to get up for the day. But then you get yourself dressed, and you're dressing in probably 10 kilos worth of Antarctic gear to move the 50 meters to the main mess tent that we'd have, and to get a brew on and get some food into you to start warming up for the day. The one thing we had to be incredibly disciplined on, the only thing I really called everyone out on early in the piece, was do not ask work questions like before 8 o'clock. So we're going to wake up at 6-ish. You've got until 8 o'clock to do whatever you need to do to get your ass out of bed. Do not ask work questions. And that was for me, and then mainly the pilots and then the field officers as well, who they'd know what team they were taking out for the day. They'd know the plan because we'd have revised that and gone through it the night before with the forecast and everything. But we're sitting there trying to have breakfast or have a brew, and you're staring out the window and your brain is starting to think about work. But the last thing you want is someone walking up and be like, oh, hey, Dave, how are we looking to go to X location? And it'd just be like, morning, how are you?
Let's have a normal conversation.
Exactly. At 8 o'clock, we'll do the ops brief and we'll look at the formal forecast. We'll speak to the forecasters and we'll refine the plan. And everyone really respected that. And it became a real key part and try and talk about not work. And there's not much else to talk about when you're living with 40 people in an Antarctic field camp. You're all living and breathing work, but you try and just keep it social, chat about different things. And that's the real discipline. That's the hardest part as well, to not have that creep.
So you're 3/4 of the way through a yearly trip, right? So how do you get the news, mate? How do you get the news? Is it a phone call?
It's a video call like this.
It's a video call so you get a video call. What's going through your head when you're getting that call?
When I got that call, so to me, it wasn't really news. And to a number of the team, we knew that was coming. We'd seen things play out with what the pandemic was doing, the impact it was having on international shipping. And we were reliant on our new icebreaker being built, which was under construction at the time, was supposed to come and get us on its maiden voyage. And that didn't happen. And the old ship couldn't get us. So there's a few operational factors that you could predict. And at the time, though, when it was formalised that, hey, you're staying longer, we're going to work out a plan later, we'll let you know. I basically started going through everyone in the team and trying to assess where they're going to be on the spectrum of acceptance and how they're going to deal with it, and to work out a plan of how to pitch it to everyone, but then realise, okay, there's going to be a few here that aren't going to go well with this for really, really good reasons. Of one of them had a very, very sick parent who, if they'd been able to get home as planned, would have had a chance to have seen them again. But now with this extension, that wasn't going to happen. There was a number of other members of the team who've got partners back home trying to homeschool multiple kids and deal with all that, going like, that's all right, if you're home by Christmas, I'll make it. And you all of a sudden go, oh, you've just not only committed the person who's here to another 6 months here, but you've committed their family to another 6 months without their parent. And you're homeschooling, you've got all the lockdowns, you've got all the job crisis, you've got all these other issues back home that, through no fault of their own, and this other decision. So it had all these second and third order consequences. And that was all going through my head of trying to work out what's going on here and how do we break the news. So what I did, so when I got the news, finished the phone call, and then I went and told my deputy station leader. She was the wintering chef, and she had a lot more Antarctic experience than me, and she was the absolute yin to my yang. And the best decision I ever made was appointing her as the deputy. And went and spoke to her and said, hey, and she knew like this. She's like, oh, we're staying. And I'm like, yep, we're staying. And we sort of hugged it out because we knew that it was going to get rough. And she's like, all right, well, how are you going to tell everyone? I'm like, all right, I'm going to go and tell 2 or 3 people who were the worst affected. I went and found them at their workplaces and just said, hey, by the way, you'll see a notice that we're doing a station meeting tonight to rip the Band-Aid off. This is what it's about.
So rather than giving a centralised brief, you went round and prioritised the people that,
I put it on the board and said, hey, we're doing a meeting tonight. But everyone was at work and it didn't really, in some ways, it didn't really change anything. So calling a snap meeting, which we could do, you hit the emergency alarm and everyone had come to the mess, which we do once, the fire alarm that go off once a week because of dust and stuff anyway. But there was no real point doing that. I just said, hey, after dinner, station meeting. The word got out pretty quickly anyway. But what I did so after telling a few key people and kind of getting the word out, setting the meeting up and making sure everyone knew that, hey, this is the sort of meeting after dinner that you turn up to. And most of the time everyone turned up. There were a few times you go, you don't need to come to this one. But then I went and got my own head right. So I went for a walk. And there's not many places you can walk by yourself in Antarctica, but luckily it was a nice-ish day, which in the middle of winter was still probably minus 10 or 15. So it was bloody cold, but you wear the right gear and it's not windy. So I went for a walk to get my own head right and go, okay, so you wanted a leadership challenge of running a station. Now you've got an unprecedented and ridiculous scenario that just hasn't happened.
Now you've got one.
So, well done, you muppet. You wanted this, you got it.
You wanted that at the highest order. You wanted to be tested by the program and the Antarctic. And guess what? It's certainly done that. How important beforehand were your briefs and debriefs? And how did your communication change?
I think, so we had a weekly station meeting and we'd have smaller ops and group meetings, and I'd do one-on-ones with each particular leadership group and team once a week, and all these different, pretty predictable structures. They were all pretty routine, and there was never anything that heated or spicy at any of those meetings. Whereas after with the extension, some of those meetings became like press conferences, and I was then the front of this situation and thing. But thankfully, and I had some great members of the team that then even like, yeah, they'd sort of be throwing questions at me and asking this and like, what? And then yet at the same time, they'd be like, we're not yelling at you. We want to get. And I'm like, well, let's get the bloody director on the phone and let's get the people that made this bloody decision on the phone. Now, we set that up to do a video call with the ops manager who'd kind of been to drive the decision. But the Zoom link was so bad, it was worse. So we're sitting in the town hall.
Frustrating.
In the cinema trying to ask questions, and it's just like dropping out. And so someone would be like, well, why couldn't you have done this? Why is the ship delayed? And what this was predictable and blah, blah, blah. And then it'd kind of be like, it's just like, So at the end of the day, I kind of made the decision like, look, I'll just get all the information I can and I'll pass it on to you guys. Please don't shoot me as I'm messaging this stuff out. We're all in the same boat. I've been as stuffed around by this as you all have. We're going to find a way to get through to the end. Let's take ownership, all the classic things of take ownership of this, the sphere of control in terms of choose how you face what you can't control and to get your mindset right on that. That became super important. Didn't work for everyone, worked for most. And that became another change of in these station meetings and from a leadership perspective, I'd always been trying to get total group harmony and 100% success at times. And I realized after that, like, this is going to get pretty ugly and I'm not going to be able to achieve that.
How do you cope with that from a psychological standpoint, or did you cope with that, and how does that affect you psychologically?
Yeah.
What was your coping mechanism?
No, great question. So probably a good percentage, probably 80% of a station leader's job, and certainly my job in that second half of the whole scenario, was unsighted by most of the team. You're one-on-one chatting to different team members constantly about whatever it is they've got going on, or their particular problem, their problem with someone else in the team, or their problem with you, or their problem with back home. And they're keeping that pretty private. So people might know they've got this issue, but they don't know you're helping them through it. And you've got all these different subgroups. And so you'd be out. And the best thing to do is rather than get someone in your office and talk and go, hey, let's talk about you. You're going out on their science project, or you're helping them with their work so that you can then have that conversation while you're shoveling snow, or while you're watching a hose spray water into a reservoir, or driving along in a vehicle, or you're out on the quad bikes and you're looking at penguins or changing cameras. That was the best way to keep in touch with the team. And I'd started to lose contact with a few of them who just weren't keen on some bit. So that became a bigger challenge. And then you're starting to go, okay, well, if I'm losing direct contact with this individual who does still have contact, what friendship networks have they got on station? Are they talking to the deputy station leader? Are they talking to the doctor? Are they talking to their boss and their other mates? And that's enough. They go, great, they're fine, or they're managing their own mental well-being without me. And yet some people did want their boss involved and others didn't. And so having to just constantly work with that became a real day-to-day grind of just keeping every individual on track, but keeping the group on track. So that was tough. But keeping myself on track then became the other part of it. And that was two-pronged. One was, like I said before, my brilliant deputy. She kept me in check. And I had a couple of other quasi-deputies in different leadership groups on the station who they backed me up and they backed me in on a lot of stuff as well to kind of help out rather than create a divide. They'd be like, no, that's what Dave said. We'll happily do it that way. And you just go, bloody hell, thanks for that. Because if they'd gone the other way, you've got other issues. So that was great to bounce ideas off them, or be able to feel that we could park the formal hierarchy and just be same level, two people stuck in this scenario, and have those chats on station was really important. The other one was then chatting to the other station leaders. So yes, we're thousands of kilometres apart, but we could set up a Zoom link or a phone call and we'd do a weekly or fortnightly catch up, and we laugh at each other's problems. And that became this great
humour in the face of adversity, eh?
Absolutely. And
classic.
And some of the tougher moments as well, which I had and my team had, you'd then be looking to history to go, well, yeah, like nothing that happened to us had never happened before, but it had never all really happened in the same year. And that became really important then of those outlets of speaking to other stations, but then looking at historical examples. And one of the worst, it really it ties the book together, but one of the lowest points was when one member of the team, he'd had enough of this particular job we were doing at the time and the whole situation. He just sort of let it out. He's like, mate, I can't do this anymore. F this, F that, F the government, F the ship, F the planes, and I quit. And I'm like, what the is going on? Like, you can't quit,
Where
mate.
are you going to go?
Where are you going to go? What are you going to do?
Yeah.
And part of your brain's like, all right, well, cool, take a tent and 6 months worth of rations and off you go. And you can't do that. You're like, no, we've got to get him back to work. We've got to work out a plan here. You've got to work with HR and the sites and the doctors and the team and everything. And you just like...
That's why I asked these questions about yourself, because once someone's head is out the game, or they lose hope and they lose belief, and they lose sight of the mission, it's super hard, right, to be able to bring them back into the fold psychologically. For
sure. I mean, a lot of that came down to control. So there's so many regulations and rules around going outside, all these different things that had kind of overwhelmed him a bit. And we were able to get him realigned and change his role and change a few parameters, which then I had to extend to the whole team, which was something as well. You go, well, don't just focus on your bad eggs. Whatever you've done for them, you got to do that for your good eggs. What about the 22 other people that didn't quit? And that was a good leadership lesson in some of those elements as well, of, okay, I'm spending a lot of time focusing on problems, but what about the other end of that spectrum? What am I doing to encourage and reward the good side of it? And that, funnily enough, they were all pretty happy anyway. I'm like, I've got to, everything I've done to solve this issue. If you need to change anything, they're like, we're happy, we're good. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's easy. And yet at the same time, it was a weird parallel that same scenario had happened on Shackleton's expedition, the Trans-Antarctic expedition back in 1914, where a member of his team had quit as well. And that got me a good laugh of like, oh, well, every Antarctic leader wants to be up there with Shackleton. And I'm like, oh, now I get some sense of how he felt when a member of his team quit. And I'm like, God, what a ridiculous scenario. But he dealt with it. And I kind of went along the same tracks as he did. He's like, you deal with it head on, you chat to the individual, you work out a plan, and you get them back, because everyone has to work and everyone has to be part of the team. And
so as all this was going on, so the chaos of the unknown, of uncertainty, of people suffering back at home, families, how did that affect the mission?
Well, a huge part of your mission down there is surviving. So you can't down tools. And that's, really a lot of that's on the trades team, which is more than half the station. The mechanics, the plumbers, the sparkies, the carpenters, the chef and everyone. If they're not working, we're not surviving. And everyone supports elements of that. Everyone's on the search and rescue teams and fire teams.
I love that. So you needed each other to survive.
100%. You can't stop. Even when we'd have a day off, 6 people and one of the leadership team would be on call at all times. And even then, you're all on call all the time. So yes, it might be there's 6 people who are at a higher degree of readiness and they're sober and they're ready to go and they're on station.
Talk about purpose.
Correct.
Wow.
So yeah, at the same time, they're just the first 6 responders to a building burning down. Now there's double and triple redundancy with most of the buildings and situations, but if we were to lose the main mess facility or the main storage warehouse or the main generator house and everything, it would be disastrous and really, really would put us all at a risk of changing it from a very easily survivable situation logistically to a massive challenge of, oh, hang on a minute, we've lost our main powerhouse and we've lost all of the food from the main security. We're now down to the buckets of flour and sugar for another 6 months. So you've got to take that stuff seriously. So that kind of helped kept us focused of, well, if we want to go home, we've got to keep working hard to keep the place running and leave it running well for the next group.
So your plan or the project was meant to be 365 days long. It's supposed to be a year. You end up, after 537 days, getting a call to say that, it's over. Talk me through that call when you knew that you were going home ultimately.
And this is such a good story in terms of it ain't over till it's over. So we got picked up, and so we did the station handover. It was actually day about 499 when we formally handed over the station to the replacement team, jumped on the icebreaker, and we had to go past one of the other Australian Antarctic stations at Mawson, by which point we were very late in the Antarctic season. So due to the pack ice, we couldn't get close enough to the station. We were about 90 nautical miles away, which is, for Australians listening, it's the distance across Bass Strait. I think it's probably the distance from Scotland to Norway or something like that as well, across the North Sea. So considerable distance. We had to do a helicopter fly off of this station. So we ended up on the boat for about a month before we even got back to Australia. But when we finally finished that resupply, set course for Hobart, finally, and this is now late March, early April 2021, we knew, okay, we're going to be home. That, yes, besides, we've done everything we need to do. We're now just on the ship as passengers, and we're setting a course across the Southern Ocean. 2 weeks from now, we'll sail into Hobart, and the whole journey will be over. And that's when it goes from just ridiculous to hilarious in terms of what happened to us. Because on the 5th of April, halfway across the Southern Ocean, the nearest land is a place called Heard Island, which is in the middle of absolutely nowhere in the Southern Indian Ocean, near the Kerguelen Plateau and the Kerguelen Islands, which is a French outpost, pretty much uninhabited. And 10:58 in the morning, I get rudely awoken from my morning nap by the sound of the ship's fire alarms and the captain just declaring, fire, 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 fire in the engine room, not a drill. Grab my life jacket, grab my survival gear, head down to the forecastle of the ship. 100 people standing in the forecastle of the ship. It's 0 degrees outside, 6 metre swell. Ship's now dead in the water. You beam onto 6 metre waves, so you're rolling 30 degrees either way, holding on to things to try and keep going. And the fire, if you look in the book or look online for this, and there's a ship called the MPV Everest, the fire had engulfed the entire engine room. This massive fireball exploded out one of the air intakes, and the ship was in a real bad state. And they had no guarantee they were going to get the thing going again. So we were very, 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 very close to jumping on those lifeboats and having to abandon ship in the middle of freaking nowhere. And we stood there for 6 hours until we did finally get, and credit to the ship's crew and a number of my team who fought the fire, boundary cooled, and did all this incredibly heroic stuff to get the ship under control, safe, and then get the other remaining engine house operable, which had a whole lot of other challenges systematically. There's a brand new icebreaker, which bit like a Tesla. If a Tesla is not working perfectly, it's like, oh, I don't want to drive today because one tire's a bit flat. This ship was the same of, oh, I'm not driving on one engine while one engine's exploded. And they had to kind of reprogram its safety settings to go, no, the best thing you can do is drive on one engine.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, and finally, so at reduced pace and about half speed, somewhere between about 3 and 5 knots, we limped home to then Fremantle, which was slightly closer on the western coast of Australia. And there was a strange poetic factor to that, like the last Australians or the last members of my family to sail into Fremantle had actually been my grandparents and my father when they'd arrived in the 1950s. So there was this sort of funny end of like I was standing on the heli deck of the ship as we sailed into Fremantle with news helicopters trying to circle and get footage of the burnt out sections of the ship and the damage as we sailed in. And that was just such a strange but somewhat fitting end to be standing there and contemplating abandoning ship in that situation. And that was the moment where you really realise like what my team had been through is they were the ones that jumped on fire hoses, that were helping people with their survival gear and helping people understand it. And they really just talk about rising to an occasion. You'd think at the end of that we would have gone like, oh, bugger this, what a ridiculous situation, I can't believe this is happening. We all just went, okay, cool. Of course the ship's on fire. Yep, that'll do. Let's grab fire hoses, life jackets, help people where we can, and do what we can to be part of the emergency response, which became a really strange situation as well. Of we weren't out of the woods. It dragged on for it took another week to sail home. Of every time the ship's engine would even shudder or change speed, people would just be out of their cabins being like, what's happening? What was it? Are we doing 4 knots now? I thought we were doing 5 knots. Why are we doing 4 knots?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
I know it all too well, mate. Yeah.
So that was
little thing. Everyone's like meerkats. What's going on?
Exactly. And rather than before that, everyone used to sort of sit in their cabins watching movies and reading books with them and their cabin mate. Everyone would prop their doors open, and it was very social on the ship as we all just sought to have this kind of unity of we're all stuck in this burning boat together. Let's if we're going to go down, let's go down as friends.
We're running out of time, and I must wrap up. Not that I want to. You've got a book called 537 Days of Winter. Now, I see that you've signed me a copy. I'm truly grateful, and I'm definitely going to get my head in that book to really bring it alive because, talk about at such a young age, leading such teams and expeditions and programs and, platoons, etc., etc. Got nothing but admiration for you, mate. I know how hard it is to be a leader, and I know the hardships that come with it. If you had one word and one word only to describe leadership, one word, what would it be?
Humble,
humility. Yeah. Do you know what? That's exactly what I was thinking. Stay humble. 100%. Humility is definitely, it helps you to really merge into a team, doesn't it? And it helps you listen and really take on board what other people are going through as well. So you can put yourself in their shoes and lead from the centre. Listen, David, you're a great dude, mate. It was great to speak to one of my own and have a conversation that we've had. Thanks ever so much, mate. And thanks for coming on my podcast again.
Cool. Thanks, Anne. Thanks for having me.
David Knoff is the author of 537 Days of Winter. I'll link the details in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining me on Head Game. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our incredible stories. And leave me a review wherever you're listening. I'm Middleton. Catch you again next time.